Hello there, everybody. Welcome to another Psychedelics Today episode with your host, David Drapkin. Speaking with Dr. Monnica Williams, that was recorded live in person in Toronto at the From Research to Reality conference a couple months back. So this is number 4 of 5 of our live recordings. There's still one more to go, but don't worry, there's plenty more conferences coming down the horizons literally very soon. Okay, so Monnica and I had a wonderful chat at the very end of the conference. Literally, someone knocked on the door to try and turn off the lights and take out the furniture of the room that we were recording in. I think Monnica had already kind of got into some more comfortable clothes at the end of the conference. And thank you for sticking around to interview this episode with me, at the end of an amazing conference. It's wonderful just to have that chance to chat. Monnica was one of the 3 kind of main founders and directors of the conference itself. So we do talk about why the conference exists, what its mission was, and how it was for her personally, kind of being involved at running a conference. We also talked about why did she move to Canada? And I think you probably know by now, I'm not the biggest patriot of American life and society. So it was really interesting hearing her experiences kind of from a cultural and academic lens that led to her moving north. And obviously, Monica's work around anti-racism and racialization being really big challenges to solidarity, collaboration, equity, justice, inclusion in our society, but also particularly within psychedelic research and trials organizations. So we cover all of those angles, as well as her role in MAPS, helping them to become more diverse and inclusive in how they were doing their clinical research. We also talk about the lack of funding into research around racial disparities. And Monnica also shared a couple of very personal experiences she's had around implicit racism, literally just being embedded on the wallpaper of a hotel she stayed in, as well as positive experiences that she's been surprised to have as a Black woman. So really personal and authentic, and I definitely appreciated that hugely. So I hope you do too. Okay, so I'll read you Dr. Monnica Williams' bio. Monnica Williams, Ph.D, is a board-certified licensed clinical psychologist specializing in cognitive behavioral therapies. She's an associate professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa, Canada Research Chair in Mental Health Disparities, and Director of the Laboratory for Culture and Mental Health Disparities. She's also the Clinical Director of the Behavioral Wellness Clinic, LLC, in Tolland, Connecticut. And she's founded clinics in Kentucky, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Enjoy the show, everybody. On Tuesday, August the 9th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Psychedelics Today will be hosting a free online discussion about the connections and challenges, research and real-life stories within the realms of psychedelics and queer identity. We'll be joined by a panel of insightful researchers and clinicians and thought leaders working at the nexus of this intersection. The panelists are Amy Bartlett, Dr. Clancy Kavanagh, Terence Ching, Ph.D., Stephen Huang, and myself, David Drapkin, as the moderator. So it's free to attend. You can go to psychedelicstoday.com/events to find out more details. And we do encourage donations to our preferred nonprofit, rainbowrailroad.org. Welcome to a Psychedelics Today podcast, live from Toronto at the very end of the From Research to Reality conference tonight. This is David Drapkin, sitting down in a hotel room down near the lobby with Dr. Monnica Williams. Real pleasure to be here, Dr. Williams. How are you doing?
Oh, great. Thank you. It's really, really nice to be here too.
Yeah, and thank you for being part of the team organizing the conference. It was really special, and I think I'd love to take a moment just to reflect on what it was like organizing it, and then now that it's kind of done, how did it go?
Well, it was several years in the making. I've been in Canada for about 3 years, and I feel like almost as soon as I got here, I was drafted or, inducted into the fellowship of the conference, the conference planning committee. And I was actually really excited and grateful that so many people were welcoming me to Canada. And this seemed like a great way to connect with researchers and other people in the field. And at the same time, work toward building this conference that was going to be diverse on so many different levels. And that was something that also really impressed me.
Yeah, so to get roped in, you really needed it to make sense and resonate. So what was it particularly about this conference, say, compared to others that was different and that stood out? You mentioned diversity particularly.
Right. Well, for one, it wasn't going to just be a typical research conference. It was going to also include policymakers and people from industry. And I thought it was a fantastic idea to get all of these different folks in the same place so that they could cross-pollinate and share their challenges with each other and their priorities. And, I think it's easy to feel siloed. And I thought that was like a really important mission. But in addition to that, they really wanted to make sure that diverse voices were included across the spectrum. So not just the same usual people that speak at conferences, but they also wanted to include Indigenous voices and and people who were doing this work in different ways and who had different thoughts or perspectives or practices. So that was important for me too, to see the really deliberate efforts at including people of color.
Yeah, it's a good point that a lot of the conferences, it's kind of like the same old people talking the same old things, and a lot of the time, people just want to network outside. But this time they were really kind of different subject with different groups of people, and these are all the people that are going to have to make this work or not. So they need to be talking to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were so many good talks, and I'm really pleased with how the conference came out. But, one of the panels that really stuck with me was the one that it included several Native American women who shared their experiences and perspectives. And I really felt like, wow, this is what's been missing. I felt like this is like a really important voice and not just one, but multiple voices, different aspects, different facets of, sort of Native American thought and experience. And I feel like that was like really such a beautiful and critical piece of the conference.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of what we'll talk about is intersectionality, and another way of thinking that is layers and kind of pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. But, there are disagreements about what psychedelics are and how the system should roll out, and kind of the war on drugs is part of that. Race is part of that. Kind of, policy and the healthcare system in America is part of this discussion about how to make these accessible, and there's a lot of education out there. Maybe we can start just by getting to know you a wee bit, Monnica. Like, how could you give us a bit of an introduction, kind of the work that you're doing now, and kind of what led up to you to working in this area?
Oh, that's a long story.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I guess when I first became a psychologist, most of my work was actually studying OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and then also OCD in communities of color. But unfortunately, there was not really like a lot of funding to study OCD in communities of color. So I thought, well, if I'm going to be a successful researcher, I kind of need to study something that can get funded. And one of my other interests was PTSD. And at the time, there was a lot of focus on PTSD because of issues affecting veterans and so forth. So I really added a lot more of work on PTSD to what I do. And so I study race and racism and the impact of racism on communities of color, particularly like the mental health impact. So I had the opportunity to do an interview with like the New York Times Magazine on racial trauma. And somebody at MAPS saw the interview that I did and reached out to me, and they were very interested in increasing the diversity of their trials, and were wondering if I'd like to maybe work with them to to that end. So that's kind of how I got started in the psychedelic world.
So when you got that invitation from MAPS, what was your first impression?
Oh, I thought they were a bunch of nuts. I'm like, who are you guys and what are you doing? I mean, you got to remember, I kind of grew up, in the era of like, just say no, like that whole Nancy Reagan thing. And they're talking about using psychedelics for like mental health. And it just sounded so bizarre and a little off the rails. And I was talking to Natalie Ginsburg, and she was telling me about like all the media stuff that they had done. And that wasn't very convincing to me, because it was like, well, like the media, they're always like interested in sensational things, but that doesn't really like mean it's real science or anything. But I didn't want to be rude. But anyway, she's like, oh, well, we also have like these research articles that we published on our studies and work. And I'm like, okay, we'll send those over. I'll take a look. And so I started reading the articles and I'm like looking at them and I'm like, wow, this is real science. This is real science. And they're doing like trauma work and they have like good outcomes. And so then I was like really curious. And so that's how I got roped in. So.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with the data, even though it's still, trials and not real world kind of, mass scale. The data points are nothing like I've seen before in doing kind of frontline psychiatric and addiction work. There's no that just doesn't exist in the real world.
Yeah, it was pretty impressive. And so, the research that I had done in PTSD, it was using a technique called prolonged exposure to help people with PTSD. And it's a very, very effective treatment if you can get your clients to do it. And the clients don't want to do it because you have to revisit your trauma in detail and talk through, like, give the whole narrative of your trauma. And you have to do it over and over again. You have to keep adding more and more details. And it's very taxing. And it's taxing on the therapists too. And sometimes therapists even get vicariously traumatized from listening to all these details. And I had no problem, no qualms having clients do this because I knew that it would help them. But then when I saw that people were using MDMA and they were getting better and they weren't having to do this, it really seemed like an unnecessarily cruel treatment. And I'm like, why would I do this when I can just do the MDMA therapy? And then it's like they're getting well on their own and they're like almost fixing their own brains in some ways. And I thought, no, this is better. This is better. This is what I want to do instead of that. And I want to have this for my communities too, for communities of color. And that was important to me because I didn't want to spend a lot of time advancing a treatment that only like wealthy white people would have access to.
Yeah. Have you done the training yourself with MAPS?
Yeah, several times. Actually, I even helped to organize a training for therapists of color as well. So I have been involved in that quite a bit.
And when MAPS first kind of got in touch, you said they needed some help having more inclusivity within their clinical trial. So can you expand on what was happening and how did you kind of look into that and help them improve?
Yeah, well, when they gave me those research studies to look at, one of the things I noticed right away was that the demographics, were very homogenous and they were absolutely right that they needed some help in that area. So I started asking some questions and it became apparent very quickly that they didn't have a lot of diversity in their researchers, in their research teams. They had all these different sites that were running the study, but for the most part, almost all the researchers were white. And so that would make it hard to recruit people of color if they don't, see people like them as part of the team. So that was one of my main recommendations. But in addition, there were many other things too that we were able to do to help make the study more accessible to people of color. For example, we revisited the informed consent paperwork to take out any language in there that might be triggering or upsetting that maybe people wouldn't be aware of if they weren't part of, cultures that had been exploited in the past through research. So just even just the idea that you would be like an experimental subject in a research study, just like that language could be very triggering, when you've got the legacy of something like the Tuskegee syphilis study as part of your cultural history. So if you can make the wording just like a little bit less inflammatory, that could make people feel more, a little more safe being part of the study.
Yeah. And on a meta level, thinking of so much trauma having racial roots in America in particular. I know you've moved to Canada. I really want to get a sense of why and the differences, and I know which country I prefer. But so much of trauma in the kind of Black community in particular, as well as Native American communities we've been hearing today, comes from kind of the racist history and contemporary kind of societal cultural structures within America. So why is that something that we need to keep in mind when we're doing psychedelic work or any clinical work for that matter?
Yeah, well, I think if you're going to do work with any group, it's important to understand the history because that helps it helps you understand the issues that people in that cultural group might be struggling with. And when you think about the history of Black people in America, there's a very, long, painful, bloody history that includes being kidnapped from Africa and having to, cross the Atlantic Ocean in a boat, shackled to other prisoners who were sick and dying. You maybe end up shackled to somebody who's dead, the whole trip, and then arriving in the quote unquote new world and being put on an auction block and having your wife and your children sold away from you and then subject to slavery and abuse for decades. And then even after a long, bloody civil war, Black people continued to be disenfranchised, abused, lynched into segregation era and Jim Crow laws, and even up into current times, Black people continue to deal with discrimination and racism. So it's a long, long legacy of pain, and just being a Black person in America, can be traumatizing because of all of the historical baggage and the fact that this continues even to today.
In your work, Monnica, have you been able to pinpoint any studies yourself that you've done or that you've come across that seeks to maybe identify, on a quantitative or qualitative level, how trauma manifests, along kind of racial lines within America? Like, how do we measure that? Like, how do we understand that? Do we have the tools? Do we have, are we able to really kind of root it in numbers, in reality? How can we measure it?
Yeah, well, we already have a lot of tools for measuring trauma from different sources, but these tools, when they were developed, they weren't developed with the trauma of racism in mind. So you might have some trauma checklists that have a list of traumas, and you're supposed to check off the ones that you've experienced, and racism isn't listed on that list. No kind of trauma related to marginalization or oppression is included. There's things like, combat or rape or car accidents. But so people may not think to include traumatic racist experiences, and clinicians aren't thinking to ask about them. And people who've been traumatized in that way, they may not be thinking that that's the kind of information that's, that's wanted. And even if they do offer it, it's common for clinicians to feel like, oh, well, that doesn't count as a trauma. So it hadn't been recognized. So there have been more recently, some clinical tools to help measure these things. Like our research team, we developed some tools as well, including a clinical interview called the Unrest, to help clinicians know what questions to ask to better understand trauma that their clients of color may be experiencing. And we also have some, clinical measures that are, questionnaires that clients can complete that ask specifically about symptoms of trauma due to experiences of discrimination. So we have the tools now really to measure it, but we didn't really for a long time. But now that these are available, one of the things I want to do is include them in the data collection for psychedelic studies so that we can see how these types of symptoms will improve as well as the ones that we already measure. Yeah. Well, you had also asked, what do the symptoms look like for racial trauma? And the fact of the matter is they look exactly like PTSD. So I don't even think we need to have a different name for it, because when people come to me with racial trauma, they have all the symptoms of people with PTSD. And the only difference that we've noticed really is that they may not, have as many of the startle type of reactions. We kind of classify those as hyper arousal, where you're keyed up all the time and you're on guard. I mean, they're definitely on guard, but I notice a lot more depressive symptoms. And I think that makes sense given that when people are assaulted by racism from every direction, they start to feel helpless. And when you feel helpless, you start to feel hopeless, and that leads to depression.
Yeah, and so we're talking about therapists needing to be kind of representative of, the reality of our community demographics, and not just having white therapists, obviously, but we're also talking about kind of cultural competence for all therapists to be able to ask the right questions and have the right ability to kind of just understand this on a conceptual level.
Yeah, exactly. Both of those are really important because, well, for one, it can certainly help to have a therapist, from your racial and ethnic group, because then the odds are that they're going to understand what you're going through, like a lot better than, say, a white therapist would. That being said, they may or may not know how to help you depending on what kind of training they've had. And given that the training that's provided to therapists often doesn't really include training on how to help people with racial trauma. So all therapists need to get the proper training on how to do this work, and how to be able to even just show understanding and empathy when people even bring their concerns about having to deal with racism to the therapists. When I teach clinicians how to work with people with racial trauma, I say, number one, like the first step is to show support and empathy and validation. And this seems like a no-brainer. You would think that anybody that has studied like how to be a therapist,
unconditional positive regard,
right? Like you would learn that on the first day, like in your therapy 101 class. But for some strange reason, when it comes to racism, it's almost like these automatic defense system comes up, and it's almost like the weapons come out, and the therapists are like, well, how do you know that was racism? And well, could they have meant something else? Or they're like, well, what does this really mean about you? Right. And this is not the direction the conversation should be going if you want the person to feel understood and if you want the person to feel safe. But it's almost like an automatic reaction that people have that is counter-therapeutic.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so important. Number one, for people to get the training to do this, and also for people to be aware of their biases, because then otherwise you end up just making the person worse.
Yeah. No, you need a lot of inner work. Generally, being a therapist, especially being a psychedelic therapist, you've got to do your own work.
Yeah.
But especially, around these issues of racism and anti-racism, and we've been getting some training at Psychedelics today around kind of white supremacy culture, and just understanding how much that is kind of expressed just in our general kind of operating system. As a culture, through our, even looking at the health system in this country, the criminal justice system in this country, even, the environmental reality of destroying Mother Earth is white supremacy culture.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, just last month, I was in Washington, D.C. giving a workshop for therapists of color to teach them how to treat OCD. And in the hotel where I was staying, in my hotel room, I had racist wallpaper all over the wall in my hotel. And I know I can see from the puzzled look on your face that you're wondering, like, what on earth this racist wallpaper looks like. and it was literally like a white man and a white woman in colonial clothes being pulled in this little carriage by two exotic animals with two Native Americans walking alongside the carriage, trumpeting their praise while they were wearing primitive grass skirts and had American flags sort of welcoming them into like this new land that they had just conquered. And that was all over the wall.
Yeah. And for a lot of people, that'd be very triggering. And
it should be triggering for everyone, frankly. Yeah. But yes, it was very unpleasant. And I'm thinking, I wonder how long this wallpaper's been here and how many people have, not even paid attention to what was on it. And just the fact that like racism is just like so embedded in our culture that we can have wallpaper like that and nobody even notices or says anything.
Yeah. And I think I appreciate your point saying it should be triggering for everyone. But I think American society in particular, having lived in quite a few different countries, there's a certain kind of patriotism here. It's romanticized. It's kind of artificial and superficial, I think, as well. But it doesn't acknowledge the reality of this country's history.
Yeah.
And those that didn't benefit from centuries of American history, they weren't the ones on top. It's just like a partial history. It's very, very kind of blindsided, I think, to the kind of more objective reality of what actually has happened and what is happening now. And I feel like the healthcare system here is coming from that place of slavery and of genocide and of abuse. Where, there's a lot of work to do around these kind of conversations, and there's a lot of resistance to having these conversations. People saying, "Oh, we live in a post-racial society. Barack Obama's been president. Kind of get over it." But that's not going to cut it.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. And you can't do good therapy with, you can't do good therapy with Black and brown people in America if you don't have some rudimentary understanding and appreciation of the traumatic history that we've experienced. And that's doubly so doing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, because not only are you doing therapy with somebody where someone has to be willing to trust you as a therapist, and they have to be willing to be vulnerable with you and to open up about their wounds and trauma. When you take a psychedelic substance, you can't leave, and you may be stripped of your normal defenses. And so whatever the therapist does and says, you may not have, the capacity to do much about it. And so if they're reenacting the same racist, traumatic types of behaviors that you've spent day after day fighting off, well, that's not going to be a very therapeutic experience.
How would you advise folks that are doing therapy work in psychedelics to get this kind of training, or to kind of get this kind of, skill set and realization about how to sit with BIPOC folks that are, using psychedelics? Like, what are some tools? Like, where would you send them, for example? What would they read, or what kind of thought processes and questions should they kind of ruminate on?
Right. Well, right now there are a lot of training programs popping up for helping people learn how to be psychedelic therapists. I mean, the big ones obviously are the CIAS program and the MAPS program, and those programs both teach a lot of good stuff about how to be a psychedelic therapist, but they still, I don't think, really address these cultural pieces the way they need to be addressed in order for therapists to really know how to do this work safely with people of color, if they haven't learned that already. I mean, ideally, every therapist would learn this when they just go to therapist school, but we know that that's not happening. And so there's a lot of clinicians who are actually quite dangerous to people of color. And then if you're going to give them psychedelics as a tool on top of that, they can really do a lot of harm. And unfortunately, these training programs don't catch them. So I think that until we can really make sure that this is a part of what every psychedelic therapist is learning, I think we're going to need to do a couple of things. Number one, I think we are developing certification and eligibility requirements for therapists as a way to make sure that those who are doing this work have some kind of professional credential. And I think that this kind of training is going to be an important prerequisite for people to be certified. And I think that that's what we should work toward. And also, Chacruna Institute has put together a training program for psychedelic therapists that really focuses on understanding issues around racism, colonialism, and oppression, which I feel like maybe is the missing piece from a lot of these programs, the kind of piece that therapists really need to be able to do this work in a better way, and to start to understand other groups and start to understand what they need to do about their own biases and prejudices so that they can do this work well and safely. So I can definitely recommend, that's a program, and I've been involved in that. We're running a program now, the very first one, and we have a fantastic lineup of lecturers, and then it's going to be offered again in the fall. And so So I think we need more programs like this where people can really focus on getting this particular skill set so that they can do more effective work with everyone.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, we really support Shakruna a lot with a few different collaborations, and I think it's amazing what they're doing. I also loved what you said about, we should be learning this at therapy school, at university or whatever kind of post-grad trainings that we're doing. And I don't think I did, to be honest, Monica, in England. I trained in Australia. I did get a bit of it there, but this is basic competence. Like if we're only being trained to work with white people using kind of more like psychoanalytical models and very clinical pathologizing models, we're not ready to work with our community. How can people feel safe with us if we don't have the competence to kind of reassure people that we're able to hold space for them?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the fact that so many people of color feel a little reluctant to get mental health care is because most of us kind of know that most therapists don't really understand them, and the process may be counter-therapeutic. And I think oftentimes people of color are kind of looked down upon, and there may be this idea that, like, well, they just don't really understand. Well, no, I think they do understand. And I think that's why they don't want to come for therapy. Yeah. because they've already had bad experiences in other aspects of healthcare, and they don't see any reason why it would be any different in mental health.
Yeah. So I want to go back to that question about why Canada. So, yeah, I don't know if it's too personal or what the reasons might be, but in a sense, like, how come you moved here 3 years ago? And also kind of what's your experience been like as a comparative analysis to life in the US of A?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's an interesting story, actually. Yeah. So I was at the University of Connecticut for 3 years. And when I started there, I made it very clear that part of the work I was going to be doing was going to be psychedelic therapy research. And people were very supportive of that when I interviewed. But then when I actually got there and started to do the work, it became very apparent that a lot of people in higher places were afraid and uninformed and ignorant about the work. And it got to the point where our research was first just not supported, but then actively attacked. And then to the point where I had to stop doing the work on campus, and even looked to taking my project off campus, at which point I was even threatened by higher ups in the university. So I realized that I wasn't going to be able to do my work there, and I decided to leave.
Thank you for being honest. And what did you find about Canada and how different it is around doing this work with psychedelics and kind of with the intersection of race? How's the response been? And maybe tell us more about where you are doing that, the team and that you're with.
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to start at the University of Ottawa, and I was able to secure a Canada Research Chair, which was fantastic. And the university, for the most part, has been very supportive of the work and very excited about the programs that I've been working with some of my colleagues to put in place. So it's been really like a completely different situation. And I'm so happy to be able to do this work at the University of Ottawa and have it be appreciated and supported. And certainly not everybody has been excited about it. And I think that would be true anywhere. But the fact that my chair and the deans are behind it make a huge difference.
Especially because we're talking about needing to feel safe in doing this kind of work for the patient with the clinician, but also for you as a academic. Like, you need to know, do you have my back? Do you support me? Are you on my side? Do you believe in this?
Exactly. I mean, and also as a Black woman too, there's a whole nother level of vulnerability that I have to deal with, because there's going to be some people that don't appreciate the work I do just because they don't appreciate me. And I have to know that other people at the university are going to have my back around that. And so the fact that I'm doing research that's already like a little bit controversial and eyebrow raising, and on top of that being a Black woman, sometimes that makes me a target.
I wanted to talk to you about something you mentioned last night in the panel discussion about the racialization of women and particular experiences of Black women in relationship with non-Black women Can we talk about that, and either personal experience or more cumulatively?
Yeah, absolutely. We can definitely talk about that.
Yeah, thank you.
Did you have a specific question, or did you just want me to talk?
Yeah, let's have a think about it. I mean, I'd love to hear the kind of top line abstract on that, and then we can go.
Well, basically, when I lived in the United States, I had a lot of collaborators, a lot of people that I did work with, a lot of friends and colleagues. But one thing that I noticed over the years is that I didn't have I had no white women collaborators. There were no white women that wanted to include me in their projects, that wanted to put me on their grant proposals, that wanted to write papers with me. And it was a little bit of a jarring realization, actually, because there were lots of people of color that I collaborated with. There were like lots of white men that I collaborated with. But I noticed that there were just almost no white women that really wanted to work with me in any meaningful or substantive way. And when I came to Canada, that was actually different. There were women in my department, white women who like reached out to me and they wanted me to be included in their projects. And Anne Vallely, she's one of my closest colleagues at the University of Ottawa. She's a white woman in religious studies, and she's the one who's been partnering with me to start this program. And I never had that before, and it was jarring. I mean, I remember one time sitting on a plane, flying into Canada, and there was a white woman next to me on the seat in the plane, and I noticed she was like looking at me. And I'm like wondering, like, am I sitting on your seatbelt or something? Like, why are you looking at me? And I realized she just wanted to talk. She just wanted to make a human connection. And this had not happened to me before. I couldn't ever remember sitting on a plane and like a white woman wanting to talk to me. And she even like helped me with my suitcase. And that had never happened. And I remember like calling my husband as soon as I got off the plane. I'm like, you'll never guess what happened. A white woman helped me with my suitcase. Because for some reason, I don't know, there was just something different about coming to Canada and something different about the attitudes people had toward me. And I really kind of spent a little while thinking about it, trying to put my finger on it. And I realized that there was some degree of contempt, I guess, that I've always felt from many people that I didn't feel to the same degree, when I came to Ottawa.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And the contempt you're speaking about has obviously racial roots, and we could speak about the contempt in the white women that you're referring to. On an internalization level, have you done any studies around Black women or Black men's experience of kind of internalized contempt and internalized racism, and how that impacts, we're talking about OCD, PTSD, addiction, suicide. So what's the internalization experience of this racism and racialization?
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be hard to live in Western society as a Black person and not to have some degree of internalized racism, because if you think about it, from the time you get up in the morning to the time you go to bed at night, you're bombarded with images and ideas that either illustrate or show directly that it's better to be white. And, white people are advanced as like the standard and the norm. And, the wealthy people, the beautiful people, they're almost all white, right? The powerful people. And so it would be quite normal actually to feel like, yes, that's like the better thing. And along with that will also come like a lot of hate for the self. And so you have to be very well grounded in terms of who you are and what you stand for and why this is important, so that you really like don't end up succumbing to internalized racism, which is, again, just when as a person of color, you start to wish that you were white. So for example, African-American families in the United States, they know that this is happening. And so they teach their children from an early age, ideally, and I mean, obviously not every family, but ideally they teach their family, their children, why it's so important to be proud of who they are as a Black American. And, growing up, I would hear my parents talk about, the accomplishments of important, famous Black people, relatives that we had, ancestors that we had that did notable things. So that we always kind of had this to rely on, to feel good about ourselves. And my parents, they would buy us like Black dolls and books about Black people, because you really have to do that to guard against like the ongoing bombardment of the pro-white imagery. And so that's really, I think that's essential. But like I said, not everybody gets that. And if you don't, you're definitely going to struggle quite a bit with internalized racism.
Mm. And there's something I've been seeing in different parts of the world. I think a lot of it is, the underground scene in America, where there's kind of affinity groups, support groups that are peers doing it because it doesn't exist in hospitals or clinics, but it's people within, it could be virtually, but often in a, say, community in, say, Oakland, California, or Brooklyn, New York, as well as in the middle of America, groups of BIPOC people that are forming their own networks to do integration circles. And also, to some extent, cohorts. I'm not sure if you've seen that. So they'll do, there are these groups that I'm familiar with that are doing this, sessions of preparation together, and then doing kind of ceremonies together and doing integration together, as well as just the separate integration groups. And I've also noticed another oppressed minority, LGBTQ groups as well, also kind of using similar models around the country, kind of really as that kind of peer support network.
Yeah. And I think that's important and critical, actually, because as a person of color, again, you're constantly being treated in like small racist ways. We call those microaggressions. And when you're in a group with just other people of color, that's much less likely to happen. And so if you're going to really talk about vulnerable things, you want to feel safe and you don't want to have to worry that you're going to get microaggressed against. And so that's one reason it's so important to have these sanctuary type groups. And sometimes people misunderstand and they think, oh, like you're segregating yourself because you hate white people. And that's not it at all. It's really just because we just need a break from all the things that are done to us, not necessarily intentionally, but that end up still being stressful.
Yeah. There was a bit of a tangent I want to go to, if that's okay, about something that Canada's doing that's a little bit different with the Special Access Program. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that so much.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I know that they are creating a path for people to be able to have access to psilocybin, for example, if they're having end-of-life distress.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm the reason I'm bringing it up is psychedelics are illegal in Canada. Yeah, still,
just like the States.
So anyone using them is breaking the law, and and I think there's a lot of racial kind of overtones to using any psychedelic for personal reasons outside of clinical trials, which is virtually very hard to get into a clinical trial. So I'm wondering, with this Special Access Program, I know it's still hardly anyone's using it. I think just a handful of people. Understanding the extent of racism and of trauma, and how few people can use psychedelics in the clinical trial method, I think the SAP, the Special Access Program, really could and should be amplified, similar to, say, the compassionate access of MDMA that MAPS has, say, in Israel or in America, like that kind of compassionate, open access to it for certain groups of people that, can't wait and that shouldn't have to wait, and not to break the law.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, it's a very bureaucratic system and it's a very slow system. And I agree with you. I would be very skeptical if people of color were having access to psilocybin through these mechanisms. And it's really kind of hard to know because we don't have all the data in terms of everybody that has had access and, understanding their racial and ethnic demographics. They don't keep that information. They don't collect it here in Canada the way that they should. So that makes it even hard to do the research. But I think it's quite likely that this particular option is not reaching communities of color at all.
Yeah. And related to this, about just the criminalization of drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an opinion about decrim, legalization? What are your thoughts around, how humans should relate to drugs, psychedelics, and also, non-psychedelics, just because of exceptionalism, all drugs?
Yeah, well, I think we have enough data to conclude that the war on drugs has really been a failure. And it doesn't really make any sense to stuff our prisons with people who may have substance use problems. Really, that should be the domain of mental health care. That's where we should be dealing with problems around addictions. It shouldn't be the prison system. That's a waste of resources, and it's not helpful. It doesn't move our society forward. And frankly, we know that a big piece of this is really just all about incarcerating Black and brown people. That's been one of the main goals of the war on drugs from the beginning. So we know that this is a failure. And I think it would make much more sense to legalize most substances. And certainly, there are substances that are dangerous, and you want to regulate them to some degree. But what the system we have in place now is completely counterproductive.
Mm. And when you look at drug use rates, they're pretty much the same between different races. But when you look at incarceration and arrest rates, they're actually very disproportionately Black and brown people.
Exactly.
Who are arrested and incarcerated.
Exactly. I mean, every community, has people who are going to struggle with substance use issues. And you're exactly right. The rates of use don't really differ that much between communities, but the arrest and incarceration rates are vastly different because of the racist system that operates to do just that.
Yeah. And simply having a criminal record in America in particular it's so stigmatizing. It really limits, economic progression, career progression, and there's a huge stigma around it, and it's very racially disproportionate.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you have a criminal record, you can't get student loans, you can't get an education, so you can't, improve your situation in life. I mean, in the United States and in a lot of places, having an education is really like the main way you can elevate your social situation. And also you can't get a job if you have a criminal record because nobody wants to hire someone with a criminal record. And so that leaves so few options for people, who've been in that system, that they either don't have, either they may have like very modest lives or may not be able to succeed at all, or may return to crime.
Yeah. And just before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, any research studies that you're currently kind of submitting or that you're thinking about in your head that I wonder if I could get that one approved? Anything around these subjects of, psychedelics and mental health and trauma and race?
Yes, actually, there's a couple of projects that I'd really like to do. And, I'd like to do a study of microdosing for racial trauma to see if this could be something that could be helpful for people of color. And I'd like to do a study of psychedelics, specifically MDMA, for PTSD in refugees and other immigrants who've had traumatic immigration experiences. So those are some things I'd like to do. And I am going to be part of the expanded access program that MAPS is doing for PTSD at my clinic in Connecticut. And our intention is that that's going to focus on people of color. And we're going to be looking at their experiences of racial trauma and how that would improve. I mean, we're hoping that that's what we'll see with the MDMA. So those are a couple things.
Fascinating. Just on the microdosing piece, why that in particular is that of interest?
Well, I actually had an opportunity to work with some of the folks from Wake Network, and they were interested in doing some microdosing studies, and they wanted to collaborate with me. And they said, well, do you have any interest in this? And I said, well, yeah, I would be interested if we could look at it in the context of racial trauma. And they said, okay, let's do that. So we put together a protocol, and submitted it to our research ethics board. And also we reached out to Health Canada to sort of get their input, because you have to get approval from them to do the study. And it didn't really go well. The research ethics board said, oh, this is completely unethical because psychedelics are illegal. Duh.
Okay.
And Health Canada was like, what is racial trauma and why would you want to study that? So we kind of ended up with not a lot of support from either end on that. So it's on the shelf for now, hoping to revisit it maybe next year.
Yeah. And I don't know if there's any way to do more naturalistic studies.
Yeah, we've done a number of naturalistic studies. Actually, we are running a naturalistic study now. We're looking at, so currently to be in a psychedelic study, they screen out anybody with a history of any kind of psychosis or schizophrenia. And one of the things that we've been wondering about is this a hard exclusion, or could some people with these symptoms benefit from psychedelics? So, of course, right now you can't give psychedelics to anybody with these conditions. So we are doing some naturalistic studies, surveying people with these conditions and asking them about their experiences with psychedelics. And did psychedelics, help? Did it make them worse? Was there no change? As sort of some preliminary data to better understanding this problem.
And that could be huge because, like you said, right now that's an exclusion criteria on all of the other studies. Not because, we know that it's going to be contraindicated. We don't know. Therefore, we want the randomized control trials to be nice and clean and tidy and squeaky perfect. But we don't actually know. And it's, in a sense, it's not fair to exclude people from trials with potentially, life-improving medications and treatments.
Yeah, exactly. And many people who have psychotic symptoms, it's because they've had some childhood traumas or traumas that have contributed to them having those problems. And we know that psychedelics can be so helpful for trauma. So why would we, just arbitrarily exclude so many people? Certainly, like you said, of course, like for the research studies, we want to be so careful, but it would be a real shame if there's some people who could benefit who just will never have that opportunity, but just because we haven't bothered to do the research.
Thank you for what you're doing. I know it's frustrating. I sense that even here in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, there's a lot of challenges here in Canada too. Just like the States, I think, people are trying to figure all of this out and we haven't really gotten it figured out yet. So the research is hard to do because you have to just jump through so many hoops and get so many approvals and have all the right stuff. But I'm used to doing challenging stuff, so I'm not going to give up anytime soon.
Yeah.
So.
And as an educator, you're educating kind of deans, and review boards and ethics panels and general population and colleagues like other psychologists. It's a lot of educating. It's going to take, probably decades to really improve that general level of understanding and awareness and kind of societal evolution.
Yeah, I agree. I hope it doesn't take decades, but
okay. maybe one, but yes, as quickly as possible.
But yeah, it is a lot of ongoing education, and that's okay. I mean, I'm a professor. That's what I do. I educate people, so I don't mind.
One thing I've loved, just kind of wrapping up on my end at least, is the word intersectionality. It's kind of common parlance now, and when I first learned about it 20 years ago, and it really didn't make sense then in my first master's degree in social work, but it really does now. And what I think about Monnica is just, in a sense, internal family systems, IFS, we're made up of different parts on an individual level. I also think of those as kind of layers of an onion. And I think of intersectionality as we have so many layers of who we are, both our life since we were born and before we were born, or our ancestors and the countries that our families have lived in. And there's so many layers to us, and on a society level, there's just so many layers of intersectionality that make us who we are. And I think there's just, particularly with contemporary capitalist culture, particularly with the way that media is nowadays, it's so easy to assume that who I am, it's very simple and like off the shelf, like this is who I am, or this is who I'm going to be. But actually, if we peel off the layers of what am I, what makes me who I am, what kind of identity have I assumed, what do I assume is a constant in my identity and sense of self and reality, isn't necessarily true, or it's just a very thin, narrow, superficial concept of truth.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because everybody has lots of different kinds of identities. You have so you have your ethnic group, your culture, your nationality, your gender identity, your political affiliation, and all these identities kind of help us feel understood and help us, I don't know, figure out where we fit in the world. So, people's identities are important to them, and and to your point about intersectionality, I think about just myself as a Black woman, like that's an intersectional identity, being female, being Black, being a female Black American, right? I can't really separate those so easily. I know, for example, that Black men in America have a very different experience than Black women in America. And I know white women in America have a different experience than Black women in America. And I feel like in terms of this piece, I feel like I can't really separate these things. I feel like they're kind of all one thing. If somebody was to ask me, well, to divvy up the, I don't know, the discrimination that I might experience due to some of these more marginalized identities, it would really be hard to do that because I feel like it's kind of just like being a Black woman is just like one thing,
Yeah, that makes sense. And I wanted to ask you if there's any articles that you could direct people to, in particular things that perhaps you've written or you're working on, or any websites that you'd like to let people know about before we wrap up.
Yeah, I have 2 new papers that have recently come out. One is basically like how to be an anti-racist clinician. And that just recently came out in the Cognitive Behavior Therapist. It's actually a British journal. And that was based on an invited talk that I gave at their conference last fall in Belfast. So I encourage people to read that one. And then also I have a paper that's coming out in the American Psychologist. I mean, it's out now, but it's like still technically in press, about civil courage. And it's like all about how to be a racial justice ally, and the fact that like that's not easy, and how we need to sort of build up our tolerance for the backlash that's inevitable anytime we want to oppose a powerful system. And so the premise of the article is that we need courage to be able to be the people that I think most of us want to be. And it includes exercises people can do to kind of, build up their stamina for racial conflict and distress.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, go check that out. I'm going to look that up too.
Yeah, there's a bunch of exercises. So, you can like take the challenge and you can do them.
Yeah.
So if anybody listening to this, if you like do the exercises, like email me. I'd love to hear how it went.
Awesome. Thank you, Monnica. Well, Dr. Monnica Williams, it's been an absolute pleasure, especially because it's the end of the conference and you're probably exhausted, and congratulations again. It's been an amazing, amazing conference.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad. And we've gotten so much good feedback about it. So I'm really pleased with how it went.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that, everybody. Really important conversation to continue having, not just once, but ongoing. And that was our second conversation with Dr. Williams on our show. And interesting to see kind of what has changed and what hasn't, and why. And when we are doing our trainings here at Psychedelics today, we're really being very cognizant of the issues of race and culture and privilege and white supremacy. So that's something that more and more we're building through our trainings, and hopefully we'll get to work with Dr. Williams in the future. Okay, so as usual, I would love to remind folks that have not yet liked us on social media or subscribed to us on your podcast app. Please do that. It just really helps, to be honest. And if you are feeling generous and if you'd like to help keep the lights on at Psychedelics Today, you can go to patreon.com/Psychedelics Today. If you're interested in our trainings, go to psychedeliceducationcenter.com. Or if you want to check out some of our other podcasts or our blogs, or to sign up for our brand spanking new newsletter, which is called Keeping Tabs, go to psychedelicstoday.com, and on the bottom right, you'll be able to sign up for our newsletter there. All right, wherever you are in the world, stay open and be well. God bless everyone.